And if you don't think this whole festival of grad presentations hasn't been soul-searching, you've missed it. Because it's been soul-searching. And with that, that's a good segue back into Dave Puxley. Dave, when your hands, soul-searching, Contemporary Anglican's perspective on soul. Good luck.
Thank you. Well, good morning. Before I start the presentation proper, I just want to pick up on a couple of things. Scott made a really excellent point in speaking about spiritual care with people with dementia. We don't exist simply on a cognitive level, right? On the level of ratiocination or discursive reason, right? We have an enormous number of modes of perception and communication available to us. From touch, taste, laughing, stamping our feet, praying, silent contemplation, all of those are clustered in and around that basic self-consciousness by which we often constitute or understand our own identity. But that's not how this question started for me. My title here, Soul Searching Contemporary Anglican Perspectives on Soul, arises out of a really long period of reflection. Kent the other day joked about Anglican understatement. Well, it's been a little while since I've been working on that, and by that I mean about the last 15 years. And in a really personal way, this began with an experience of death and grief. I want to paint you a quick picture before we start into the meat of the presentation. Imagine me with far more hair. I know that's hard. It was like down to here, you would not believe. Standing in a funeral home, looking at the body of my grandmother. She'd passed away a few days before. I was still reeling from the shock of that loss. And I was there to pay my respects. But as I looked at the immaculately preserved body, I knew that there was something different, right? Something wasn't there anymore, and that loss was irretrievable. And so it raised for me the question, what the heck is it that was different? Because it all looks the same. Same way as I look at any of you, right? You're all extruded in 3 dimensions. You walk, you talk, sometimes sounds comes out of our face and we know what it means. But that's not what was there anymore. It was literally a body. So I was forced to ask, for the first time in my life, really, what's the other bit? Is it a bit? Is it a thing at all? What is that? What's my soul? So we'll move to the question quickly. Then a brief description of the methodology. And then the really fun stuff, a quick ontology of the soul, and then we'll hear voices speaking about their own lived experience of that concept. And I think whatever strength is in this project is a testament to the candor and the courage of my participants in responding to very open-ended questions like, what's your soul? Many of them said, I'm not really sure where to begin, and I think it was a point of courage to say that. So the question itself is, what's your soul? This, in some ways, is a bit of a funny question. We don't hear a lot about soul as such in modern discourse. We hear about soul music. We hear about the sad recent passing of the host of Soul Train. But we don't hear about whatever this thing is, except sometimes in the realm of poetry. And that's not mere poetry, because poetry has its own structure, its own life. It can't be reduced to anything, but often we don't hear about it in theological discourse that much anymore. The methodology that suggested itself to me was, as you've heard from many others, a phenomenological approach. Now, you've heard phenomenology described various ways so far, and quite competently as a tight, focused approach to a few number of subjects which can allow for a very deep engagement with the material they offer. But phenomenology is not a technique. Phenomenology was, in its current form, begun by a fellow named Edmund Husserl, who was a mathematician and a philosopher working in Germany in the early part of the 20th century. Between the 26th of April and the 2nd of May 1907, he gave a series of lectures, which were later published under the title The Idea of Phenomenology, in which he proposed to return to things, phenomena, as they appear. To return to things as they appear, and attend to the really concrete particularity of the manner in which they appear. This means not bracketing any element of experience. So, I mean, we've all had this experience, right? You get an email from somebody, you're not sure what to make of it. The emoticon at the end doesn't really do much, and you're left wondering, was that sarcasm or are they just a jerk, right? Part of it is that you've missed tones, body language, smiles, falsetto voices, all sorts of things that allow us to give nuance to what we mean and allows meaning to form both sides of a dialogue. This was recognized in a deep way by one of Husserl's students, a guy called Martin Heidegger, who says of the human being in particular that the human being is called Dasein. It's the being there. It's that which opens a space in which meaning and beings are disclosed in their appearance. But what he says about us is that because of that sense that beings are in our space, we come to ourselves as a question. He'll say, we are ourselves the being to be analyzed. The being of any such entity is in each case mine. Right? You never experience that as not yours. Because in a certain sense, everybody here is a limit of the world. Right? I mean, your body wanders about in it. But whatever it is that I couldn't find in that funeral home is a limit of the world. So I set up my study interviewing 4 participants who are all members of the same Anglican parish. So their common thread of experience is a common and regular experience of Anglican worship, hearing the same sermons, experiencing the same service of communion. Turned out they were 2 men and 2 women, all over the age of 35. The interviews lasted an average between 30 and 60 minutes. But let's set the scene a little bit before we get there. We need to set some ground. Now, the folks in the class were teasing me that they were surprised it took me this long to get to the first guy on the slide. He is maybe my best friend in the whole world. I mean, that lives in a book. His name is Plotinus, and he was a 3rd century Egyptian philosopher who worked in Rome for the most part. Yeah, just go read everything he writes. It's actually all in one book, so it's convenient. He writes this question. This begins the second last piece of writing he ever did. So he asks, pleasures and griefs, fears and assurances, desires and aversions and pain, whose are they? Now, Scott talked in terms of dementia earlier about the destruction of centers in the brain, right? And if we identify consciousness with the brain of some thing that arises as a kind of distillation of brain activity, then this doesn't make any sense at all, right? If we're asking whose are they, we're asking a different question. We're not asking what's the mechanism of it. We're not asking what does LSD do to that. We're not asking what does the destruction of centers in the brain do to that. What we're asking is whose are they, not where are they or what are they. And that's what initially caught me about Plotinus. He's asking this question in a way that interrogates the real person as opposed to whatever way we'd like to bracket that person out so we can manage it. Augustine makes the same point. I mean, he learned really well from Plotinus, so it helps. He says, people travel to wonder at the height of mountains, at the huge waves of the sea, at the long courses of rivers, at the vast compass of the ocean, at the circular motion of the stars, and they pass by themselves without wondering. Think about that the next time you're at the travel agent, right? You can save yourself money too. Now, maybe the most difficult statement here is the process of a long period of reflection in the ancient world on just precisely this question. It arises from a guy named Puxley, who's a 6th century figure working in Athens. He was the last, or one of the last, heads of the school founded by Plato nearly 1,000 years earlier. And he'll write in his Elements of Theology that everything capable of reversion upon itself is incorporeal. I know. WTF, right? What he's talking about is the fact that, right, this thing is made of a solid, or several solid, one hopes, pieces of wood. It can't take itself as an object, right? It can't come into its own experience as an object. Anything that can do that doesn't have the parts like this that would need to smash all into one place if we're using a physical model in order to do that. What he's saying is that things that have a grasp of themselves, right? Just think about right now. What are you thinking about right now? Right? Where is your consciousness at this moment? You've got memories in there, you've got feelings in there, you've got probably remembering some meal you may have eaten recently or not. You may be thinking, this dude is off the wall, right? There may be all sorts of things floating around in there, but you can actually get a grasp of most or not all, right, if not all of them, all at once, right? That capacity is something that what operates under the criteria that we know about physical objects can't do, right? It's just not in the nature of that to do it. So what we're talking about is something extremely subtle, right? Something invisible, something that we lose sight of the moment we try and pin it down. So there's a degree of ambiguity in this project that I hope will excite you, because it excites me. Now, the big themes that came out of my interviews with the participants, who will all be known by pseudonyms, I'm calling them Matthew, Hannah, Vera, and Joachim. The big themes were the three on the top here: relationship, death, and the moral center. I had thought of not including the last three, partly in sympathy with what Scott was talking about. We could just be here for the rest of the day. But they came up so persistently as intertwined concerns with these three dominant themes that it would have done a disservice to leave them out. So we're going to begin with the biggest one, which is relationship. Matthew says that I'm most aware of this sense when I'm doing something with someone one-on-one, kind of. And you make a personal contact, then I feel often that it's close. This was in response to a question about which practices nurture your sense or your awareness of soul. Each one of the respondents noted that prayer and regular attendance at worship foster this sense, but spent more time on other aspects of their lives. Hannah says, soul is something else. Soul I see as, if I reflect on what I'm doing, who I am, where I am, and why I'm there and in relation to others. You can't be a soul, I think, you'd be a lost soul if you were just only yourself. Now, this touches on something we heard about earlier this morning in Helen's presentation. The barrier that confronted the chaplains in their experience of patients at deathbed is part of what's involved here. Well, there are two old saws that people speak about human beings and what human nature might be, right? What the soul might be. One, from a very long time ago, says that essence precedes existence. So, right, things come out, say a duck comes out looking like a duck because it was born of a duck, right? There's something which by nature happens as a duck, or by nature happens as a human being. And the details get filled in by experience. Another more recent challenge to that came out of the school dominated by figures like Sartre and Camus and de Beauvoir the existentialist in France, who claimed defiantly that existence precedes essence, right? So we aren't who we are until we're working ourselves out in situ, right, in the middle of things. And the trick is that both of these are true, right? That's part of what I found insistent in the words of my participants, and part of what I'm trying to insist on in this study is that we can't say yes or no to one side or another of one of these paradoxes. We've just got to say yes to the whole thing and explore that. Joachim speaks of the risk inherent in relationship, in opening oneself to that persistently real and stubbornly real other. So one shrinks back, you know. I don't feel like letting people into that space that you kind of need to let people into in order to be nurtured. Joachim, in a beautifully insightful moment later on in our interview, said, you know, you don't pray and tell God, here I am, speak, if you don't mean it. Don't do that. It expresses the same risk, right? How are we going to be called to account if that is our behavior in prayer? Hannah says it simply, you can't live by yourself. This is true on a practical level, but equally true on those immeasurable levels in which we understand and discover ourselves. Vera understands relationship in terms of a community of affirmation and support. She says we all like to be praised. We all like to be acknowledged as being somebody, as being a person. I'm sure we may all be able to remember moments in which that wasn't the case for us. And the aridity and emptiness of those moments is, I think, part of what characterizes the demand and the need, the appetite for relationship that the participants voiced. But this finds a limit in death. Finds a limit in birth, but none of us remember that, so we all look at the other one, which we don't know about, but is on our minds, in our minds. Death, for me, characterized the beginning of this journey, and was not something I explicitly asked about, but came up repeatedly as a theme when one thinks about the soul. Right? Hannah said everybody tries, or almost everybody, tries to find a meaning in life which goes beyond death. And over the course of the discussion, it became clear that, if I'm not misinterpreting it, that this meaning in life which went beyond death crosses the border, right? It's partly how one remains in memory of those who are left here. But it also speaks to, well, Hannah described it in terms of physics. She said that in physics, no matter is ever lost. So I wonder about what's sort of in our heads, where that goes. It's like wind, but her sense seemed to be that it doesn't just disappear. Vera spoke about her understanding of heaven and the kingdom of God as relating in a fundamental way to her understanding of the soul. She said, I think I'm just going to be a radiant being, but I'll recognize family and friends. There's a transformation in the mode of existence that occurs in her understanding. But it's one which, it seems, opens up a real access to the other which we crave and sometimes experience in this life. Hannah points out, of course, also that the soul that never dies, the soul that lasts forever, it goes to God, however you define God. The moral life was a theme that was important for all four of the participants in this study. Matthews pointed out that, sure, soul is an abstract concept, right? It's sort of out there and you can't quite define it, but I think that we kind of judge someone's soul by the way they behave. So here we fall back to the existentialist mantra that existence precedes essence, right? What you do in your life configures for others who you are. That expresses that. Joachim captured this distinction beautifully. He said, when I perceive my soul, it's that part of me that is me, that functions as the person apart from the flesh that I am, that guides me in all that I do, in my path, in my thinking, in my thoughts. Right? At once, the soul is me, and the flesh that I am is me. Right? There's something involved that doesn't allow those two moments to fall apart. Vera says, what I believe everybody's soul is this thing inside. I can't see it, but it guides me, tells me if something's right or wrong. There is an inborn appetite for the good in the human being, in the understanding of these participants. There's an inborn appetite there that can be nurtured or misguided. It can be formed in all sorts of weird and wonderful ways. But if we really attend to the deepest impulses of our being, then we're attending to something that is by nature good. Hannah makes the point again very clearly. What you do or don't do in your life is the expression of your soul. Now, selfhood, which is actually what got me interested in the question in the first place, turned out not to be one of the dominant themes in the comments of the participants. Hannah says that the soul really represents the complete individual. There's something transcendental about it, something you can't grasp. In a certain way, this is as much as to say there's something that always and unendingly surprises us about the fact that other people do the things they do, or even that we do the things we do. St. Paul will talk about his own perplexity at his own behavior. Right? I do the thing which I will not, I will the thing which I do not, and I don't know why. So there is an irreducible unutterability about the real essence of the soul. One of my favorite writers about this says, often, he writes, as I am thinking and attempting to grasp the highest reasons of things, I reach out to those things which are within the grasp of my thinking, and I reach for those which are outside of the grasp of my thinking. The things that are inside that grasp I call being. The things that are outside that grasp I call non-being. This whole is held together and called by the Greeks physis and the Latin natura. That's the great John Scotus Eriugena at the beginning of his On the Division of Nature. So as you can see, for him, the fact that a human being reaches and can define and distinguish between what is manifest and what is not manifest actually founds the whole of reality as we experience it. There's some really basic stuff at work that is almost unspeakable in its simplicity. Joachim asks, I think, a pretty reasonable question for any of us. Is our soul corporeal or incorporeal? Is it part of us or is it not part of us? Is it a separate entity that, dwells within us? The short answer is, I don't know. Now, I would contend that, in fact, the soul is incorporeal. But that might sound like I want to cut it out of the body somehow, right? And say the body is just a sort of whatever that you get stuck in and then someday you get free of, right? That would be glib and false. The trick, right, is saying that these things are in fact together in a way which respects two natures in one place, right? We might say that the body is the place of the soul, rather than saying that I have a soul. That makes it into a commodity I might lose somehow at a crossroads, like Robert Johnson, and gain the ability to play fantastic blues. You know where I'll be later, right? Memory was also a consistent theme implicated in everything that we talked about. Many of the participants related their experience through anecdotes. Memory is the storehouse of our life. It's a place where we can cherish and hold up and reconstitute the meaning of things. Hannah spoke powerfully about an experience of life in wartime and the effect that had on a perception of soul at a young age. She said, I was 7, 8 years old. The only time I screamed was that I had to jump over the fire. This was from incendiary bombs. You learn to just be something very small, and you hope that nothing will happen. Later on, she and her family found themselves in a bunker in which other folks arrived and asked to come in. And she said, well, these people all of a sudden started counting beads and saying, Holy Mary, Mother, pray for us now and at the hour of our death. She said this was not a practice that her family had undertaken, and so it was a bit baffling at first, but she says, I didn't want to die yet. I know that. It was as if suddenly they had found their soul in that bunker. And they became real people all of a sudden. Sympathetic people with real hopes and fears and desires in a situation very, very similar to her family's own. The last theme I wanted to touch on briefly was grace. The word grace wasn't often used by the participants, but words like joy, love, comfort predominated, even though grace did come up a couple of times. Joachim says that in the midst of all the woe that he's experienced in the last few years, I have a 2-month-old grandson. He's Jesus to me. In the midst of all the woe comes this hope for new life. So it's just been tremendously healing to me. There's a way in which God has worked good in those lives by putting them together in a certain way. I don't mean in like a mechanical sense, but there's something deeper working there. Vera said about an experience of an Anglican retreat. She went to Cursillo. She says that there she came to know, or she says, I came to know God on a one-to-one basis, and that He loves me just the way that I am. Just this. I am me, and He loves me. That's it. I would be remiss if I didn't point out a couple of places in Scripture that we can look to in order to found, perhaps on more comfortable and solid ground for ourselves, a way of reading perhaps the data in this project as emanating from and returning into particularly patterns of Christian life, and here patterns of Anglican Christian life. The first time I saw the word soul in the Bible is actually at Genesis 2:7, where the human being, right, the blob of clay that God's smushed up and breathed into, is called a nephesh. That nephesh is the result of a breathing into the nostrils that makes an animated being. In Greek, it's called a psukein zosan, right, a living soul. And in Latin, an anima vivens. In the New Testament, one of the more succinct treatments of this is given in 1 Thessalonians chapter 5, verse 23. The writer there speaks of tapneuma kahe psuke kai ta soma, right? The spirit and the soul and the body as constituting the human being as such. What I want to argue is that when we speak of soul, we can speak of a principle that mediates between a realm of ideas and a realm of sense experience. And we can speak of something that holds the cosmos together by virtue of its percipience. But what really comes out from this data is the fact that soul is our life. Soul is what's here. Soul is what's sitting beside you, right? Soul is what makes all the trillions of quantum decisions that decides where a body goes, right? That's what makes those decisions. So at play in my thinking about this was a question about how we got to where we are now, where often enough we describe ourselves as brain activity, or the fact that I'm feeling unwell and lost my breakfast earlier this morning, right? Not fun, but I could reduce myself to that, right? A pretty brutal reduction, but anyway. That, in one way, is called a material reductionist or scientistic position. A position which grows up over the course of modernity and reacts to that is what we can call a fundamentalist position, right? One that wants to go back to the fundamentals of faith and Scripture, and often reads Scripture in ways which are completely uncharacteristic of the tradition before it, right? In a literal sense in which we cannot deviate one jot or tittle from the actual words which have some sort of immediate or obvious meaning. My study, and I think the comments of my participants, assent to neither extreme, but in fact engage the problematic that dichotomizes them, an essential dualism which sets us over against itself, a possibility in terms of whose rejection one can practice a kind of self-definition. This means that you have to work only at the level of a border dispute, right? What makes Jody different than me, apart from his fantastic tie, right? If I attend just to our difference, what alienates us from each other, then I can find it really easy to make Jody an inert group of things, right? Isms, whatever he subscribes to, right? Oh, he's that intensive short-term psychodynamic therapy guy, right? You could knock me out the same way, right? He's a dirty old Neoplatonist, and he's never going to get better. But that, right, that practice renders the one who practices it as inert as the one on whom it's practiced, right? I have to be reified into some kind of stupid ism in order to make you into one in the first place. Just to appeal to the proof that X is not Y says nothing about X and doesn't say a whole lot about Y, right? This isn't the case with the selfhood that's grounded in soul. That selfhood is non-dual. That selfhood is a horizon where a number of things, right? Sensation, feeling, memory, cognition, mystical intuition, bodily experience, right, are held together in a way that's not reducible to anything else. Soul takes on the aspect of a coincidence of opposites, whose content is therefore unlimited and can't be determined from without. Even though in a certain sense we know what it is, we still, in any particular case, must assent to the dictum that existence precedes essence. So what we're talking about is the emergence of human being as such, and the blessed reality that that remains a question. So, my question to you is, what's your soul? Thank you.
Questions, I dare you.
Bring it on.
I'll get some up here. Whoa, look at this. Good.
Awesome job. I love the Greek, by the way. It was great. Just, I guess it's kind of a two-part question. I think that what came out of the experience of your participants was that the nature of the soul was that it is called to the good and knows the right. I guess, where do you fall on that, and where does nurture come into this? Like the corruptibility of the soul?
Vera spoke really eloquently to that. She said at one point that people don't start good or bad. Now, I mean, there's stuff from book 1 of the Confessions, and I'll get there in a sec. But her point was that the environment in which one grows up has an enormous amount to do with that, right? The structure of experience which will inflect the way in which any of the ideas that we form come into a kind of crystallized structure or a concrete structure can't be taken away from an irreducible desire for the good, right? Okay, let's put it this way. In the middle of Dante's Purgatorio, chapters 6, or cantos 16, 17, 18, he gets into a discussion with a guy called Statius, I believe, about the nature of the will, right? The love that moves the sun and other stars. And he says there are two kinds of will in human beings. A natural will, right? The one that wants to like eat and sleep and reproduce and have fun and get what it wants. And as far as that goes, in the same way that a cat wants what a cat wants, that's never bad, right? All that does is attend to its own immediate good, right? He says the rational will, the one that reflects on its purposes and can therefore say, well, I'm going to manipulate Ricky so that he will grow out his beard longer because it's fantastic. Right, that may be my own aesthetic preference working on you, right? It's not a huge depiction of evil, but I was trying to steer away from Dante's regular depiction, which is like 14th century Italy, and nobody wants to go there. Right, the kind of things that leads to betrayal, murder, mistrust, adultery, all that stuff that he's talking about in Inferno, those are attempts toward the good that have some fatal flaw, right? We can love too much, we can love not enough, we can love an object which diverts us from the basic, almost inchoate love that grounds our existence. Okay. Oh yeah, the confession stuff, sorry. Right, in book 1 of the Confessions, babies are evil, right? Babies want things and will get mad at other babies even if they don't need them right now. That, in a certain sense, he'll call the imprint of virginal sin on babies, but also is absolutely vital to their survival, right? And Augustine knows that. So there's a slipperiness here, right, that has to do with time. Yeah, sorry, Janice.
Ricky likes the Greek, I like the ink blots. Tells you the difference between us.
Yeah.
I was really taken by Hannah's story of being in the bunker and the incendiary bombs and how she saw the soul of those who joined her in the bunker. Now, in a very convoluted path of thinking, I'm wondering if in your discussions with your participants and any other readings you've done, if the term soulless is actually applicable to anybody. You know, we've heard reports of people speaking to others who have done horrific things, and there's something missing in their eyes, and they're described as being soulless.
Right.
Is that possible?
I mean, if you want to talk on the level of sort of theory, the general fixture in the tradition is that soul is what makes a body alive. So in that sense, nobody is soulless, right? You'd be compost. But if we're talking in the way that, for instance, Matthew talked about a period of his career when he was doing a job that he found just ground him down and just took everything out of him and gave nothing back. He called that a soulless stint. That he was just aware of survival, getting the day-to-day grind done, and not about joy, not about whether what he did had any meaning for himself or for others, whether it made any impact or made a difference in the world that he inhabited, right? So, I mean, David Dean would talk about this in terms of disenchantment of the world, right? And we can become disenchanted with ourselves as well. Now, there are also moments, and I think quite powerfully in what you brought up with Hannah's comment, I think that real questions of immediate survival are at stake. And it's quite possible to describe oneself as having lost one's soul in that period. And that kind of language did in a certain way come up. But it's more like misplacing it because there's something really, really immediate that we have to attend to here, right? Right in the same way that I remember the first time I found my son with a kitchen knife. He's precocious and likes to get on top of stuff, and he loves counters. So I came into the front room one day, and there he was with a giant santoku, right? Held one hand on the handle, one hand gripping the blade. He said, "Daddy, Daddy, I have a knife." I said, "Yes, you do." But, right, my concern was not about his formation as a human being. My concern was about him having all his fingers at the end of that 10 seconds, right? So I wasn't concerned with what animates his body or with its henodological relation to the good, right? I was concerned about a knife in his hand. So I think there are moments in which we can misplace or lose sight of that, and that might be a way in which we would understand, speaking of that soullessness. Because it means we'll lose sight of it in other people. Yeah. Joachim spoke most frequently about spirit, and I have a few quotes here that I didn't print out that I thought might be useful. Joachim said that the soul for him is sort of indicatively the personality in a way. But he says, I guess maybe we can't share our soul, but our spirit is something we can pour. He was speaking in relation to the Magnificat, right? My soul proclaims the greatness of the Lord. It's something we can pour, that we can share with others. And our soul is indicatively ours, but our spirit is to be shared. So there's something that I think responds to that quotation from 1 Thessalonians that inscribes the individual human person in a wider relationship and network of living beings and beings as such. Plotinus, for instance, would call this the world soul. He says it's not anybody's soul. It's not even the soul of a planet or a god. It's soul as such, right? That he would call spirit. Christians will speak of that in different terms because we have a language of spirit that, for Plotinus, would be too close to the Stoics to confidence. Yeah. I don't know if that helps at all. Okay, good.
Lori?
I am humbled by your eloquence, and I love your wordsmithery. So I'm going to also comment on the ink blots. And I'm assuming that you were looking at Rorschach.
Yeah.
And I'm wondering if you appropriated his blots or whether you made blots of your own. That's my first question.
Okay. These ink blots were found, in a superimposed series of websites.
Okay.
They were found, they're not, most of them are not original ink blots. Most of them are ink blots that folks have made up on their own. So they don't, in this case, they don't remain confined to the original 10 ink blots, and so the standards of interpretation relative to those original 10 ink blots would have to be elaborated for these. Although, as I understand,
okay, so they're
that work
not
has been done.
completely happenstance, they were nurtured.
They were happenstance in the sense that somebody put some ink down and squished it. But this apparently was a game. When Rorschach was growing up, this was a game kids played, and was his first moment of interest in it.
Some kids still play it.
Sure.
So that was just very interesting for me because I found because you are, as I say, such a wordsmith, and you are, as I say, humbled. I am humbled by your grasp of languages, not just language. I love the fact that you juxtapose that with a type of art that is essentially a happenstance, and I really enjoyed looking at the structures of those images and wondered if, outside of literalism, you have meditated on the images that you chose.
Yeah, I have been.
I find them fascinating.
One of the reasons I wanted to use the Rorschach images was, partly they're fascinating things, right? They're sort of endlessly interpretive. Yes, and one of the interesting features of these is that, from what I can tell, having looked at Rorschach's thought about his original experiments, right? He comes out of the Freudian school, and in one respect, asserts an a priori meaningless world, right? A world in which competing forces blindly strive for success, right? But that's a world in which beings have oddly developed some kind of consciousness of themselves as existing. And so we wonder what the heck that is, right? And that's what he's after. How do you respond to it when I ask you, what do you see in this image? Do you move your head? Do you tick? Do you cough? What do you say? What kinds of interpretations do you produce? And so what I wanted to do in part was to highlight that by having the images, and so resist, hopefully, that assumption that the world is from the outset meaningless and we somehow plonk meaning on top of it, right? That makes meaning into a noun that we can move around as a commodity. I'd rather say that meaning is a verb whose limits form us, right? It's not that we make meaning, meaning makes us.
One final question. Karen.
Dave, well done. I just have a question as to how your participants reflected any form of Christian traditional faith in their experience of soul. Did they? Or was it much more at a...
This I found a really interesting aspect of the data. You notice that most of them didn't talk about being Anglican, right? In particular. Now, part of that, I think, emerged from the fact that they were all taken from a or selected within a shared context, right? And each one did at one point or another mention prayer, regular worship, and reading scripture as practices that sustained them. But what I found was that didn't take up a significant portion of the response data. And so I thought it was better, at least for the purposes of this presentation, to concentrate on the elements that they did spend time on. And most often the elements were questions that arise about the way core teachings of the church have been received, right?
Yeah, and would you be able to just say a bit, maybe, of any conclusions you have as to why, you know, they have at some point in their practice, but in their sense of their soul, it seems to move away from traditional understanding.
Right. The tricky thing with tradition, right, is that traditus, the word that tradition comes from, literally means something that's trajo, right? That's drawn out, and that literally goes hand to hand. So if we imagine tradition not as a monolith that somebody is dragging into the present, but as more like that clay that turns into a nefesh, right? Then the passage through hands doesn't leave it unaltered. And so the question about tradition, I think, is actually really key. One of the things that came out of this was, for instance, Hannah said, I don't hear many challenging sermons. We need to be challenged in sermons to think about these sorts of questions. And given the opportunity to do that, one of the calls that came out of this, which really was consonant with Rob's project, is that adult education is something that we need to be more intentional about. Adult education, where it happens, is happily received and welcomed. But if we can find ways to be more intentional about that, and more intentional about fostering a capacity to speak up and voice that desire in a way that's going to get fulfilled, I think these kinds of discussions could be happening all over the place. And in fact, Hannah pointed out that we should be just giving this set of questions to parishes and letting them put responses up on their websites. So if anybody wants the questions, you're welcome to them.
Rob had his hand up, so I'll... Are you okay? You sure? Okay.
Before Jody takes back over, I think we should give him a hand as being our Master of Ceremonies for this whole time, and for having shepherded us through this process. And John Ray, too. John!